Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video is about the difference between a head for circle track versus a head for drag racing. Why they're different and the reason for it. So that's what this one's about. Before I begin that, I need to do a little talk real quick. I want you guys to understand I'm pretty good at cylinder heads, but I am not a god at cylinder heads. I do not claim to be the best at cylinder heads, but I'm pretty good. Real knows real, and I know who's better than me and I know who's worse than me. I also know that the people that might be worse than me now may be better than me than in the future. I also know that what I'm doing today probably is not going to be the same thing I do, say, a year from now, 6 months from now, and so on and so forth. Because as a good cylinder head porter will evolve. So in other words, they will change what they're doing with time because they're going to find stuff that works that doesn't work. And then maybe that what didn't work, they have to analyze why it didn't work and see what they need to change to make it happen, or was it because of something else? Now I say all that because I really want you to understand this one is mostly based off, this video is mostly based off my own personal experience, what I've seen with them from what customers have done, and there's a lot of generalizations in this. And the reason why is because it's kind of a broader subject, but I'll do my best to explain everything as we're going through this. But I wanted to start off by saying that. Okay, so the first thing you need to know, and this is not about cylinder heads, but it's about the engine so much itself. So I just happened to grab this dyno sheet. This is the one from the 350 that's in the S10. This is before he messed up and forgot to change the cubic inches, so the volumetric efficiency is wrong. But anyway, this is one of the earlier pools. It works for the example. What you need to know about an engine is most engines make peak torque and peak horsepower in a certain distance from each other as far as RPM. And that varies. So in this one, if I look at it, I made peak torque at 515 torque, and that was at 6,100 RPM, and peak horsepower really occurred at 7,400 RPM at 660. That gave me a 1,300 RPM window. Now, I promise you all this, what I'm telling you will make sense as the video goes on. This is really where the engine works its best. So ideally, if I was doing this for drag racing, you would have your torque converter a few hundred RPM before peak torque or after peak torque, say at 63. So this way, when you launch, it drops back to peak torque and carries it. You would then shift a couple RPM after peak horsepower. So when you shift, you're kind of dropping down to it as well, because there's a curve here as far as the power numbers. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because engines can vary this much, but typically what happens is between peak torque and peak horsepower, there's usually a span between 1,000 to 2,000 RPMs. So a really efficient engine, or that's got a broad torque, broad range of horsepower and torque, those two might vary as much as 2,000. For instance, on the Engine Master engine, they actually did vary 2,000 RPMs. So peak torque occurred 2,000 RPMs later. Here comes peak horsepower. They're broader. The less efficient, or maybe more efficient at a certain RPM engines, might shrink that range. So that's something that you need to kind of think about. The reason why I bring this up, in drag racing, we're really only focusing on that chunk of RPM right here. So if I was looking at it. So if I look at this 350 engine, really, I'm not going to focus, this was strictly for drag racing, and this was the dyno sheet. I'm really going to focus on right here. So the car is going to be geared to run right in this range. Maybe a few hundred RPM after this, and definitely not before this. So right here in this range. Okay? So that's how it works. If I was to take this head that was in this, or take this engine and put this on a circle track deal, what's end up going to happen is the driver itself, because I should point this out, the engine doesn't care what cylinder head's on it. It's going to make power. It makes power where it makes power. You know who cares? The driver. If I put this engine and I put it into, say, an A mod, where the track's tacky, in other words, it's going to hook up, the driver would hate this engine, because this RPM range here that they run in is not the same RPM range that you would have in a circle track car. And so I kind of tried to draw this so you get a better idea. So here's a map, kind of a circle track, just to get you an idea. Now, the class that the A mod run, at least in our area, they have a 7800 chip rule. So if I was, let's say, starting lines here, this is our flag stand. So this would be, if you're looking at it, this would be turn 3 or turn 4, and that's turn 1. So let's say your race is underway. They got here, they left off. and the car's coming this way, they're going to hit 7,800 RPM, they're going to back off. It might drop down 5,000 in the turn. When they start coming out of the turn is at 6,500. Towards the end, 7,800, they're on the chip, back off 5,000, 6,500. So if you looked at that, the range then went from 5,000 to 7,800 RPM. In case you're wondering what that span is, that's 2,800 RPMs. Okay, that's a broad band. Most drag race cars do not operate in those ranges. They operate between, like I said before, about a 1,500 RPM range. If you ever are curious, you can do a data log, go to your race your car, see where it drops on the shift and where it recovers. If you have a 1,500 RPM drop on a drag race, you're really not that efficient. Some cars will get more efficient where you're only dropping, say, 700 RPMs. For instance, the Camaro only dropped 8. That's pretty close on the shift. Now, Pro Stock cars probably only drop 500 RPM. I'm assuming it's really hard to see their tach when they're doing it. But they're really, really in a narrow band. So drag race operates in a narrow power band compared to the circle track range of 2,800 RPM. Now, by the way, if you look at this and you're looking at it right now, you're like, well, still, why wouldn't your engine work well? Because it's still making, the one thing about this is it never got pulled below 5,000, at least in this pull. If you did, you would see the torque down low is horrible. And I'll show you kind of a graph to give you an idea what I'm talking about in a minute. But it's really not that great here. It's great here where it's going to be racing. It's not great there. So if they were to try running in a circle track, what they would have here is when they backed off, you're in no torque area and it's taking forever to recover. And for those in circle track, you're getting past. You might get past on the straightaway, but the biggest part where you get left is in this leaving. Usually it's the leaving or the entering, but most of the time the fast cars are the ones leaving fast because they look fast down the straightaway too. So if you've got no torque coming off, you're getting left behind. It's flat out that way. So, however, this looks like in a normal situation, this would be almost as if you were trying to qualify. The problem is if you get good at circle track, you are not in this situation at all. And you're like, what? Some of the rest of you watching is like, what do you mean? This is if you're qualifying and no one else is on the track. If someone's on the track, and there usually is because it's a race, the line you might be wanting to take so you can hit the right stuff might be right here and coming off and going perfect. Or maybe you're the high one, you want to run the high because that's where the groove is. Doesn't really matter. Point being is, if some other car's in your way, you might have to back off more than 5,000. Like your RPMs might drop down to 4. So what happens is, even if this was good down at 5,000, it's really not good at 4,000. So you get stuck in lap traffic behind someone. Now you don't have the power to accelerate past them, so you keep constantly getting stuck behind this car. And what is really bad is on restarts. So restarts, of course, it really depends on the lead car. And that lead car, he's got to play the game. He's like, just fast, slow, got you. And then he takes off. And you got that. I know you guys got those guys. You know, the ones that are just like creep, speed up. No, slow down real quick. Now I'm gone. They're just playing the games with you. So in the meantime, you're like trying to pick up the RPM. And if you're off just a little bit, you're done. You're getting passed by 3 or 4 cars that you just passed. But because somebody wanted to spin out on the track and park themselves so they can have a caution, you're now back where you were and you take forever to pass them. So RPM range on the circle track, this is moderate. In reality, you almost need a 4,000 RPM swing. So you really, you want to be good, not so much really at that 3,500, but it'd be nice if you had it so you can get around cars if you have to get around traffic, on restarts or whatever else. So the point being is, circle track operates in a much larger RPM band than drag racing. Okay, so that's a big thing you need to know. Now, someone's gonna say, what about street strip? Those are cars that would go on the street, and then occasionally they make it to the drag strip. How I look at them is they're pretty much just a drag one. Like, I do care more about the torque here down low, but nothing like I care about here. And you're like, what do you mean you don't care about torque on a 3,500? What about on the street? I'm gonna go ahead and ruin a whole bunch of your hearts right now. If you're focused on torque at 3,500 RPM on the street, I think you're wasting your time. And let me tell you why. On a typical street, you're pulling up to a red light and you see I don't know, an LS Camaro next to it, and you're in your big block Chevy and you're worried about torque, you're already messed up. Because that street, and this is unprepped, you're just at a stoplight, and you go to give it gas, those true street tires are going to spin. And you're going to get left by someone that's maybe making less torque than you are, because they're able to hook up. And then they're going to be like, see, I beat a big block Chevy. No, they applied too much torque, couldn't hook it up to the wheels. They spun, you won. That's why. So on a street strip deal, I do try to give them torque down low, but not to the extent of where I'm focusing on it as much as I would say for the circle track guys. Because I know in reality, you're really not hooking up. But when you go to the track, it's the same thing. We're like, well, wait a minute. What about, I do go to the track when I be racing and the track's prepped and everything. You're right. But on the track, again, you're going to be, if you're doing it right, you're focused on that 1500 RPM range, or really a couple hundred RPM either way, swing in this range where your peak torque and peak horsepower were, if you want to run your fastest. So the numbers below it, I'm less concerned for, besides I don't want you to feel horrible and slow as you're driving. But in reality, I know the true streets and true street tires aren't going to take a whole lot of torque and you're just going to spin. So I want it fast here. So I still will give you more here. So the difference between, I'd say for me and drag racing is I just really focus here. A street strip, I might bring it out a little bit further and focus on that. On a circle track, the RPM band is way worse. Okay, so anyway, there's that. Let's look at some curves that kind of show you what I mean. All right. Now, this is a while ago. This would be the two Ninja Master engines, but they're both the same size. They're both 406s, but you get the idea here with the curves. This would be, this blue one that you see here is a different combination than you'd see with this red one. This would actually be the one that, it was a bigger cam, and this one was with when we were doing tunnel rams and the heads were really big. This was it was a mistake. But if you were looking here and I was circle track racing, because if you look at the peak power, this blue line has more peak power than it does the red line. So this one actually, peak power wise, if you looked at it just from the peak power standpoint, this one's better. But if you look in this range, it's worse. So if you're circle tracking and say you drop down to 4,000, if you got the engine that makes more power, you're a turd here compared to this guy. This guy's leaving you on the corner. When you could finally catch him in the straightaway, he's already gone past you and he's in the turn and you're back to here again. So you can kind of see where peak power looks great. So in a drag race, if I was, say, a drag race, peak torque here and here, the blue one might win, will probably win. But in a circle track, the one that makes less power but more torque in this area, he's winning. Flat out, it's how it's going to happen. So that kind of gives you an idea. This is a different example, but I wanted to just kind of show you a difference in like engine size. This is a 350, so this is actually the engine that was in the S10, but one of the earlier iterations. Next to no torque, but it carried long ways compared to a 406, both flat tappet camshafts. You can see which one would win in the circle track and in a drag race. I just want to show you that. All right, but anyway, the last one, this is just a bonus. This is a circle track car. This one was a set of Dart Iron Eagles. They were 215s, and this is what it was a modified. Back in those days, they ran those before they did the whole Brodick spec head class deals. But anyway, this is what it ran. You know, here, this is the black lines, and they sent me the heads to port them, and no cam change. The heads and intake were sent to me. It was a Super Victor, and all I did was port the heads and port the intake, and that's how much it gained. So I don't mean to tell you, but this thing's way faster. But this does bring me up to another point. This little side story for you. When I was dynoing the engines, they were showing me one of the other customers that they had, and he had this similar to this black line. So this one I think is making like 500 horsepower. I'm telling you this because circle track racers in general, it's so hard to build an engine or to design a cylinder head for them because each driver is so different. Because what this guy, he had a curve similar to this, but what they did was he's like, it isn't making enough power, it isn't making enough power. He kept complaining. Well, anyway, he broke the head or something went wrong with the head and they couldn't get it fixed in time, but he was trying to make a race and they had a set of Vortec heads on there. And so he threw a set of Vortec heads on. It went from making like 550 that you see here to 485, lost horsepower considerably, gained a little bit of torque down here. He was way faster on the track. And the reason for that was because it was coming off the corners faster. So of course he accelerated harder. So he didn't need all that horsepower because he had more torque down here where he was running. In other words, his gearing was wrong. And it's just the way he was driving made it feel faster, even though In reality, the Dart Iron Eagles were so much better. It was the way he was driving the car that made the head look worse than what it was. So that's a huge thing. For instance, I got one of my customers, he runs in the bottom groove, and if you look at him on the track, he looks kind of slow on the turns, like he does. Straight up comes in hard, but he's on the low side, and he just rides the entire low one. He doesn't creep up, he just stays at the bottom of the turn. So if you're looking at it, he'd be coming in. He comes in normal groove, stays tight here, but he's low the whole way, and he ends up low. He won't start coming wide until about here, and then he's low again. And if you look at him, you'll have another car smashing it in hard, like a lot of speed coming into the turn, and looks faster, and he looks slow in the corner. But this guy, since he's gone more distance, in the end, when it comes out of the corner, this car that went in faster is here, and he's here, and then he comes off. However, if you gear it right, this guy should have more exit speed than he does. For whatever reason, it works for him. Probably because of the way the car is geared and the way that makes power and the way he drives. That's why I say before, the engine doesn't care, the driver cares. Okay, so I thought I'd show you that. So what's this got to do with cylinder heads though? All right, the real big difference in the cylinder heads is the port design itself. In a typical drag racing head, because I know I'm only going to focus on this area here, I'm designing a port with the size and everything else that really works here. Okay, so that's the reason why typically drag race heads are bigger, because we're only going to operate in this higher RPM band. We're just focusing right here. Okay, so for instance, this is a GB 2300. This is more of a drag race port. It's pretty big. There are several people, sprint car guys specifically, that run this head, but the port is much smaller, and the reason for it is because drag racing, I'm going to target this RPM, but on a circle track, I'm going to make it smaller because I need to target a larger range. They might get to the higher RPMs for sure, but also they're going to be at the lower RPM for sure, and we want them to be able to accelerate out of the turns and continue the whole thing. So in general, the reason why the head's smaller is because it has to operate over a bigger band. Giving up some of the peak horsepower isn't that bad comparing to getting out of the corner at the lower RPMs. So in general, the drag race heads are bigger because of it. We're targeting a different RPM. That's one thing. Now the other thing that comes up, so because the port's smaller, by the way, typically the velocities are higher in the port because, again, we want the different torque and such to help them accelerate out. The other thing is the valves. Now in a typical drag race head, we'll actually put in bigger valves because we want the more area. Well, again, on a small or a circle track stuff, we might put in smaller valves to because we want the velocity. And I've told you before, is like I always go bigger valves and always it goes faster. Yes, except for maybe something like this, because like a say a small block Chevy head such as those, the minimum area is that the push rod pinch, which is right here. Okay. But in like a GB 2300, the minimum area is the throat. So if I'm making the valve size bigger, the throat size is getting bigger, and it's going to be a slower responding port. Compared to this, I'm making the valve size bigger, usually because of the valve spacing, I can't make it big enough anyway. But this is usually a restriction. So downstream, it's different. The head just kind of different. But that's part of it, part of the reason, The other part is weight. So in a drag racing deal, if you think about it, we go with the bigger valve. We're usually more aggressive on camshafts as well. So we'll put way more lift in it, and the things will be pretty nasty. And if you try to do that on circle track stuff, what would happen is, remember, they're going to get hotter. So a typical drag race engine, we don't only, at least in my experience, I try to keep it at 160 or lower. On the circle track stuff, they'll be 210, 220, 240. They'll be hot. And I don't mean to know if you knew this or not, but when you heat up a valve spring, it loses its tension. So, and also if as the race is going on, it loses its tension. If you got a really aggressive camshaft, the spring itself can go in the valve float. Now they're dealing with it through the whole race, and it beats up stuff, and it's really just not good. So several of them will now put in a smaller diameter valve just to help with the weight, so they can do something different with the spring so that it lasts longer. Is it that just nature of the beast? So me in general, like if it's 23 degree head, I try to still put in the biggest valve I can, but on these, it's a different story. You don't really Remember, and also I should point out too, the valve kind of dictates all the area around it too, on the heads that are like these. So if you have a bigger valve, typically you're making the whole port bigger. On a head that's where the push rod pinch isn't really the restriction. That's not necessarily the case here. But anyway, that's one reason, is the weight. So we keep the weight down, we keep the velocity usually higher at the throat on these type of heads. So that's part of it. So like several people getting like SP2 heads off NASCAR, and you'll notice there'll be like a 218 valve. But then like you might get a head like this with a 225 valve for a drag racing. You wonder why they did that. I'm just speculating on the NASCAR part, but I'm sure a lot of it has to do with weight and also the velocity at the seat itself, because they're a different situation. And I bring this up because the only reason why I even talked about this is because some people asked on the 13 degree and 18 degree Brodix heads, why were they so much flowing so little? And I told them they're really designed for a circle track head who needs a smaller port volume so they can get out of the turns. Now this is a philosophy thing. Several people, which I don't necessarily agree with, will put a larger exhaust valve in it. So usually the small block stuff, Ford, whatever, will run on 1.6. But if you saw some of the Brodix things that they have, like the 18C and even that 13 has a 1.625 exhaust diameter, which to me is too big. But they'll put it in, usually it's because of cam timing events. So they're trying to get more cylinder pressure to get more torque. So they use less exhaust duration. They make it up by having the exhaust valve bigger, exhaust throat bigger, and gets the exhaust out. That's a different philosophy from what I do, but that gives you some idea. Now, hopefully this kind of explains some of the differences, because I really wanted you guys to see that the biggest difference is size, and because they operate over bigger RPM range. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. You guys have a happy 4th of July, and keep your fingers and toes together. Take care.